Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
My next guest began speaking with me when I made programs like this for the first time back in Spain about 10 years ago. He's a remarkable man. And he's one of those guys we mention every now and then. If I start doing his resume or his curriculum vitae, as we say here, we'd lose half the program. He co-authored the amazing Angels Don't Play This Harp. He's also written Earth Rising and Earth Rising 2. I can't recommend those books highly enough. He's the son of the late US Congressman from Alaska, Nick Begich Sr., of course, and he's a former president of the Alaska Federation of Teachers and Anchorage Council of Education. Like I said, his resume, we would be here doing it all day long. For 20 years, I'm guessing, or more as well, he's been challenging globalism, challenging mainstream media and the globalist narrative, and doing that in a brilliant way. We've seen him on so many TV shows, BBC television, we've seen him on Sky, we've seen him on many documentaries. Now, his website is earthpulse.com. Bookmark the website, earthpulse.com. And earlier this year, in fact, after we'd spoken to him back in January, he made a terrific interview discussion with one of the InfoWars reporters. And it was about something which is very dear to our hearts: the disconnect between people, the emotional disconnection between people, which has never been greater than it is now. Why can't people connect emotionally or spiritually with their fellow human beings? Why is it happening? What part is technology playing in that? And much more besides. The video that Nick did is on earthpulse.com. I'll tweet it out. It's always brilliant to welcome back our old pal, the great Dr. Nick Begich. You look well, my friend. We're on radio, but I can see you on camera. You're looking well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to be back with you today on this topic. So, the whole idea of in all the work I've done in technology, this is what people ask about. Is really solution oriented, and when you really get down to it, it fundamentally comes back to, what are we fundamentally as human beings? How do we relate to each other? And when you think about sort of the distance created between us, we thought that this ability to communicate, globally so simply would be this great boom to open dialogue and innovation. And in some respects it has been, but in others, it's narrowed our focus and it's kind of distanced us from the physical connection with people, where we actually are sitting with someone, exchanging not just the verbal information, but also the energy that comes from that exchange. And you don't get that same dimension when you start putting electronic media between us and each other. And fundamentally what happens is the electronic media becomes not just a gateway for communications, but also for others a gateway to us and to some level of our awareness or consciousness, or certainly our thinking.
Nick, you take this back to the advent of television, don't you?
Absolutely. When I think about it, television as it started and advertising as it started, in a way to kind of move populations, television was the greatest of innovations in that respect, and keeping people informed. But when you consider the effect of modern communications, where a lot more is learned about how the brain works, how we respond, not just to visual images, color, light, sound, and so on, but then how do you move people more effectively in a certain direction? That's the mystery of advertising, right? Well, today, given 20 years of research in the issues of mind effects, it's pretty clear where that has evolved to. And presently, political outcomes, economic outcomes, and really the direction in which society has gone has largely and increasingly be driven by media, starting, of course, with television being the big push, and even before radio. I mean, when you think about radio as a vehicle for getting information out, what an innovation. And, now today, instantly, globally, information flows.
Do you know what's interesting, Nick? I came up in commercial radio, And I learned a lot about the genesis of radio, about the dawn of radio. And I'm going to keep referring to the video you did with Alex's reporter on InfoWars because it is brilliant. It's funny, Nick. You did that about a month after you were last on with us, sometime in March. And I watched it, and I thought it was brilliant. And I thought, well, I'll leave him alone because it's only been a little while since you were on. And it went on the back burner. I should have really gotten you back on sooner to talk about it because it's hugely important. We listened to radio, Nick. And radio is an intimate medium, and it was beaten into me as a presenter, a young presenter. Richie, you're speaking to one person. It's an intimate one-to-one medium. You're having an intimate conversation with a listener. However, Nick, when you go back to when radio came into people's homes, we listened to it together back in the beginning, and we engaged with one another while we were listening. Is that right?
Right. That's right. And it was more of a conversation stimulator. Afterwards, there was discussion, there was interaction, people were interacting about what they had heard. Today, it's not. You're absolutely correct. It's an individual event, a listening event. It's not a family event on a Saturday afternoon.
Absolutely right. And that's hugely important. And then television came along and changed that and changed the dynamic of how we receive media. What's amazing, earthpulse.com, by the way, this is really good work that Nick is doing here. It's very important work. There's a physical manifestation in people that are being held in thrall or in sway by the media. And you discussed this, Nick, and this is fascinating. You can see this physically in people.
Right. And it's, what happens is you actually fall into almost a light trance-like state when you're engaged with media. In fact, just look around any restaurant, any place where people are gathered, and you'll see it. People have completely are lost in their devices, even getting run over in traffic, right? I mean, it's become an obsession, and yet it is now the intermediary. I mean, consider it. It is the intermediary between two people communicating in person as a substitute. Even in places where people are gathered obviously on a date, you'll see couples not communicating with each other but interacting with devices. This has really altered the fabric, as I see it, of not just information and communication, but how we gather and exchange ideas. And what has happened is the information age has really not enlightened us by broadening our view and understanding of others. It's in fact narrowed us because people tend to gravitate to only the media that resonates with what they believe in. We tend to focus more on what reinforces rather than what enlightens and educates, which is diversity and a different sort of view of the news than we get now. And I think that's, again, an important change that's occurred in the advent of modern technology. And, we warned about this back in 2000 when I wrote with the late James Roderick, Earth Rising, and it was really the direction in which technology was taking us and the lack of humanity within it that gets lost in the shuffle. And when I did that with Alex Jones, it was really unanticipated. We had laid down quite a bit of video that week with a number of his team, and what happened in a dinner discussion just before the weekend when I was scheduled to head out, we ended up in this discussion about consciousness, and Alex wanted to shoot film right away, and it was really contrarian to what I ever expected to be doing with Alex. But the point was, we agreed to do it. It was going to be 10 minutes. It turned into 45, and was probably the most powerful thing I've done with Alex, or in really a number of years with anyone. And what happened in that dialogue was it was more of a discussion about how do people change? What do we really do about all this stuff, and what's the effect of it? And the bottom line is, for me at least, is recognizing the divinity in each of us that changes the way in which we come at each other, if you will. And I think that no matter which of the major traditions, religious traditions you embrace in the world, they all speak to being created in the image and likeness of God in this sort of a hologram, if you will, a microcosm of the universal. That's what we are as human beings, as I see it. And so when you look into the eyes, the window of the soul of another person, what you're looking at is divinity within humanity. And, coming at each other in a different way from that perspective is possible, and being very different in terms of political or belief systems. I mean, I think about my own family, in terms of politics, and we're all heavily engaged. I got a brother that was a mayor and a U.S. senator, another brother that was a state senator. We are Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians in my family, and we all get together and have these incredible political holiday debates.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we walk away as brothers and sisters, not metaphorically, actually. And I think metaphorically the same is possible in the larger context of our societies. And we've lost that bit of humanity that I believe was driven by mutual respect and recognition, ultimately, of our divinity. And that's what we need to recapture. If we really want to see solutions, we have to recapture that recognition of what we are, who we are, and in the context of where we live, start affecting change, not from the standpoint of fear and paranoia, but from the standpoint of remembering the power that we truly have within us.
The brilliant Dr. Nick Begich, gentleman as he is live on the line from Anchorage in Alaska today. Earthpulse.com is Nick's website. I recommend it. And there is a link on the homepage to the video we're talking about. Watch it later on. Don't do it now. Pay attention, children. Don't be so fidgety. It's how to break the zombie trance. Now, it's funny because we sometimes get annoyed when we're in beautiful parks, Nick, in the northwest of England, and we see people walking around. There's a beautiful lake over there, wonderful trees, wonderful landscape, topography, and all of that. And you have people on their phones. And I nearly got to the stage where I started to kind of develop a bit of Tourette's, Nick. I started to get a bit, curmudgeonly, where I'd say things to people. I'd cough and say zombie. Then I thought that's very impolite. It's wrong. But you brought up zombie. It is. Now, what you described there something very important, the echo chamber. How the technology has led us to seek out those who agree with us and those who affirm us, which is terribly destructive. You talked there about the wonderful conversations that you had and have with your family and your friends, where you disagree, you argue, you might snipe, but you're totally happy with your ideas being challenged. And something else, while we're talking now, a listener called Lynn has just sent me an email, and Lynn said, listening to Nick there, it occurs to me, Lynn says, that when you're chatting away with your friend, what do? You touch them. You sometimes touch them. You touch them on the shoulder. There's an energy exchange, right? And she's listening to you, and this is coming to her mind. And what this device is doing, it's actually making us contemptuous of one another. It's removing the physical contact, the energy exchange. So the obvious question is, Dr. Nick Begich, is this deliberate, Nick? Was that considered when these devices
That's an interesting question, because, it breaks down a lot of aspects of us as either a deliberate effect or a side effect. It is the effect of the kind of technology that we utilize to interact with one another. And the bubble effect of it that you spoke about, we have to deliberately seek out, I think, contrarian information from our normal in order to really reflect on it. Because otherwise what happens is what we've seen is something occurs because it reflects more of the reality of the larger world than the one we might live in, like Trump getting elected or Brexit. And then the opposition to this, because they lived in such an isolated, self-enforcing world, it's a total shock to them, to their system, because they had no preparation for it. They've sort of insulated themselves until the hammer drops and something occurs that they weren't expecting. You really need to dig in and seek out that alternative contrarian view to balance your own, and recognize that people don't come to it most of the time out of some sinister belief. They really come to it out of some fact pattern that they've evolved. And this is where I think recognizing that about most conversations that we're in are well-meaning based on knowledge that people hold. So if we listen carefully, we'll learn a couple things. We'll learn what information they hold that we don't, that might enlighten us, or vice versa. We may learn what holes are there that we can fill with knowledge. And listening provides that, and recognizing that the other person is as divinely created as you, and we ought to give them the courtesy of hearing them. And I think that's really it. And I don't care whether it's on a microcosmic one-on-one basis or whether it's done by nations and nation states. And having the experience on both ends of that spectrum in my family, I can tell you the mechanism is exactly the same. It has to do with respect and recognition. And to change the world, it has to start there. And I think we get lost in that. Technology now separates us. It is a wall between us. It is the priest between us and divinity in the 21st century, the priest of the new technological revolution and evolution that we've now placed between us. And that priest collects all of our data, all of our information, and funnels that for commercial, political, and governmental purposes. And this is a huge invasion of who we are on so many fundamental levels. And the real answer is why? Why do they seek this knowledge? Why do they seek this control? It's because of the recognition of all of these projects that I've spoken on for the last 22 years regarding the mind and consciousness. They recognize that we are that potent power. When we lose our fear and anxiety where our higher states of consciousness can actually be reached, because it cannot happen. When you're in fear and anxiety, these higher states cannot be reached. So mind control is the simplest of all. Keep people in a constant state of agitation, and the odds are very few, if any, will emerge out of that soup. And that's exactly what's happened. And when you look at the media interaction today, it feeds on that. And actually, the contextual nature of media today really shapes culture more than it is shaped by culture.
Nick,
it is programming.
It is programming. There's a lot of questions coming in from listeners, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. Thanks for doing this today, by the way. Another busy day for you. It's always great to have you on the program. It must be said, on the subjects you cover, for me, reading David, who I know personally, of course, the late great Jim Mars, somebody of course you knew as well, and Jordan, hugely important in my development and in my coming to believe. But I'm like you, I'm absolutely open to people shooting down my belief, but to my belief that it is deeply, deeply sinister, and it is deliberate to keep us from understanding what we are and what we're capable of collectively if we stand up to it. Loads of questions on this. It's at Therichieallenshow on Twitter. The great Nick Begich is on the line from Anchorage in Alaska. Nick, people are asking, do you feel that there's a connection between this and the coming scary DARPA, the Pentagon technological wing, this coming kind of transhumanist thing that we're very worried about? Do you think there's a connection between what we're talking about? That's question number one. And then another listener wants me to ask you about children. Why is it that when smartphones came in, people above a certain age couldn't be, as we say in Ireland, Nick, couldn't be arsed with the smartphones, couldn't be bothered with them, but yet children are desperate to get their hands on them, to the point where schools in the UK are reporting children are getting help for addiction to these devices. Take the first question first, Nick, the transhumanist agenda. What do you think of that and the connection?
Well, things are dramatically changing in terms of how humans are treated, and we are more commodities. I mean, in terms of how elites look at us. This is not the divinity in which we arrived on this planet and who we are. And this is, I think, when you look at Pentagon planning, military planning generally, they take the most paranoid, darkest view of everything because that's their job. They are the paranoid thinkers within our cultures because that's their job. They need to think of every horrible thing that could ever happen and try and build a plan around it. And believe me, they got a whole bunch of plans on the playbook.
Yeah.
But the point is, that's why in civil society, at least, we like to think at least, that militaries don't control our governments, because we would come to very different conclusions and militaries would come to, given the nature of their thinking and the responsibilities that they have. Not the same. Today, so many governments and militaries are intertwined in what Eisenhower warned us about so many decades ago now, of the military industrial, and now I would add, as many have, the academic complex, that has really started to shape too much of our institutions, because the amount of money spent on warfare, quite frankly, it's a big business. So is a lot of other things. When you think about multinationals and the elites, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry, aerospace, communications, and so on, most of these establishment organizations have been built on the status quo, which is death and separation of people. And fear, and maintaining a certain level of fear to get people to do things that otherwise maybe humans aren't so inclined to do, like killing each other.
Yeah.
The technology today now, when you talk about children, several things are happening. Gaming, for instance, which are on all of these smartphones that kids are playing with, are, when they develop the games, they use three-dimensional MRIs to look at the brain activity of children playing these games to determine how to stimulate specific centers of the brain associated with the same ones associated with sexual stimulation or drug addiction. So the idea is literally to get you addicted to the game by knowing exactly how that light sound interaction affects you on those levels. And I mean, this is what has essentially happened. So children at a very young age are habituating to systems, whether it's television, video games that are designed to stimulate at a heightened way reactions within children, and that creates these addictive behaviors that are then, obvious to any parent who's dealing with it. Take the phone away and see what happens. I mean, it's incredible what you can see happen with these kids. So that's the design of the games. There's no restriction on it. That's what they're intended to do. And guess what? They really, really work. And that's what you're seeing when you make those observations.
Nick,
and I see younger children habituating to this.
Sorry to interrupt there, because this is hugely important. A few months ago, Nick, well, it's more like 8 or 9 months ago, I picked up one of these virtual reality headsets that you connect to the smartphone. Now, the reason I did it is I've never been a gamer at all. But because this was coming up a lot on the program, I decided I'd get one to have a look at it, so that if I was to make a comment on it, it would be, I won't say informed, Nick, but mildly informed. And I got this headset, and it's very, very bizarre, and it's weird, and it definitely does things to you that maybe I don't have the vocabulary to express. But I asked David Icke. Now, David has quoted you many times over the years in his books. I said to David, what do you think? And David said, I'll tell you what, and it's amazing because you've said this yourself. David said, I think, Richie, there's a very strong possibility that this virtual reality, and now the new iPhone has got augmented reality, which we might talk about in a minute. What it's doing, Richie, is it's taking us yet another step away from who we really are.
Right.
It's another barrier, and that didn't occur to me, Nick.
And the face recognition feature for IDing also will tell whether you're happy, sad, frightened. It'll denote not just who you are, but your emotional state at the time, and that's going to be recorded. Now you start to think about your traffic and your internet searches now being connected to how you actually feel, what you think and how you feel. Now you've got a little higher resolution of the human being. You've got your digital doorway to your house kicked in a little more effectively, as they dissect who you are as a human being as far as they can tell from all of your data interaction. Now, when you think about data interaction, 3,000 contacts through your internet, which is a lot, but it's not very much when you consider people's general usage through your electronic interfaces. That's not very many, whether it's your phone or pad or computer. But from that, you can tell what somebody who lives with you for 20 years knows about you.
Yeah.
And you can also tell and predict what you will do better than you will predict yourself. That's where the technology is today. Now you add facial recognition, you add all of the video streaming. I mean, you're in Great Britain, the most monitored population on the planet right now. You have no presumption of privacy in downtown London anymore, than if you were standing in the middle of a mic'd up recording studio, because that's how it works today. And that's how they unravel crime. They just go to the crime location, start unraveling where everybody went, looking at the video feeds, and then you can also look at audio feeds. And all of this is being collected. And the idea is, well, at some point, all of this gets sorted. And then at some point, you have a real profile of every living soul that ever interfaced with a machine.
Their likes, their loves, their desires, their needs, their fears, you've got everything. Now, nobody over the years did more to explain the practicalities of, mind control, how it could be physically done. None of us will ever forget the shock on Jesse Ventura's face when he went to meet you and you showed him how this could be done. So our listeners are asking us today, you've shown over the years how brainwaves could be manipulated from afar. Are the phones and the tablets now making it easier for a nefarious presence to do things, to make us think a certain way, to make us acquiesce? Go ahead.
It's very easy. Any electromagnetic carrier, whether it's cell phones, cell towers, the power grid itself can even be modulated to affect people in certain ways. What you're really trying to do is create a coupling effect where certain brain activity or brain waves will lock onto an external signal, whether it's flickering light, certain manipulation of sound, and electromagnetic fields can create this coupling effect. And then what happens is your general attitude changes. You can change emotional states of large populations applying this technology to anything. On the cell phone basis or on a device that's particularly catering to you, you can even tailor that, to specific populations or specific viewing groups or individuals for that matter. The technology, as it gets more invasive in terms of where it is and what it does, actually provides a higher and higher resolution of who we are, and then an ability to manipulate who we are through the feeds that come our direction. And this is just in the overt, obvious ways. And then when you start considering emotional variability and the things, for instance, on a phone, you could interpret a person's facial expression as being unhappy and then feed back a signal that changes your mental state to one of a little more blissful. Well, you might like that idea. It's like putting perfume in a room, except for it's still just covering up the stink.
Yeah.
You still need to fix the underlying problems. You just can't mask them. And this is what I think we start to lose as we move further and further in this dimension. For instance, even post-traumatic stress syndrome. The answer isn't stop fighting wars or find a better way to do it or something. It's instead, let's figure out how to wipe people's memories clean so they can't remember what horrible things happened. Well, that might work and might seem like a great idea until you start to wonder, well, what sinister thing might the government have our military men and women do that they might want to blank out their memories?
Yeah.
Because it flies in the face of every value every human being that's a living soul would ever represent as human. It violates. I think we need to really scrutinize consciousness and what's happening within our consciousness when it's being manipulated on the scale in which it is. And the simplest method, again, I want to emphasize this, is create a situation where people feel anxious, fearful. That is the gateway to turning off your super awareness, your ability to reach these higher states of consciousness and make the kinds of analytical decisions that aren't related to flight and fight responses or a herd kind of mentality.
Get our, as David would say, get our energy, get our state of being into a low vibrational state, and that's when we're wide open, is how he would put it. Massive amount of comments coming in here. Alison Lyman is listening to this program in Oslo in Norway. She's obviously not Norwegian. Well, maybe she is. Maybe she married somebody called Lyman, but I shouldn't be making assumptions like that. But she says, is Nick worried that the next phase of this is implantables? If you get children and young men and women addicted to the technology in the way that you described, that it will be easy to get them, to accept implantables. I know you've talked about in the last 12 months companies in America that have gotten their workers to accept a chip under the skin. We saw that, I think, in Ohio or somewhere like that. Nick, this is the sort of stuff that we go out on commercial radio. I know there are listeners saying, those two guys are crazy bastards, And we're not crazy, and this isn't crazy. So what about the implantable as the next stage, do you think?
Well, actually, even in government of Mexico, in their Justice Department, a couple hundred people were given microcircuits to track their movements. The idea of utilizing microcircuits for lots of different reasons. I mean, part of the big sale pitch is of human enhancement. For instance, they're talking about corneas that you can have implanted in your eyes that you can interface with your cell phone or your computer and have a live screen, or that'll also give you enhanced vision, give you infrared, ultraviolet, things outside of your normal scope of vision. So, I mean, I think what's happening, a lot of this is augmented technology as an extension of self, is how a lot of children view it. It's part of them, and how they attach to things. This becomes the sort of the expressive model. More and more that I think is potentially there. Implantable technologies, you're going to see that become a fashionable thing, and people not really contemplating the trade-offs, the potential trade-offs, and the exposure that you have to personal privacy. And some people don't value personal privacy because classical education doesn't teach us what we need to know. Now, experience does. That's why we get a stronger knee-jerk on personal privacy out of, say, Germany, especially East Germany, where there's a recent memory of Stasi and Hitler, where people go, you know what? Information is really important and personal privacy is really sacred. And they remember it because they know what it's like when it's violated. We have forgotten because 200 years of relative complacency in the United States from the time the British were kicking our doors in, right, to quarter their troops. So personal privacy in the 21st century needs to be readdressed. What it means needs to be addressed. And the effect of consciousness on what we do and its interference deliberately by militaries and others needs to be suppressed. That is a violation of the very essence of who we are. No technologies without fully informed consent should be allowed. And with children particularly, utilizing technologies deliberately to stimulate them in a certain way for certain outcomes. Would you allow your children to be drugged without your consent? Would you allow them to be indoctrinated without your consent? Because that's the kind of technology and the applications of technology that we're talking about in this century. And we are the gatekeepers, this generation, the gatekeepers of our personal liberty and as it's expressed in our personal privacy.
And now we're into solutions, because what we've covered thus far with Dr. Nick Begich, it's earthpulse.com, by the way, Earth Pulse. Nick has been talking about the emotional disconnect between people, the part technology has played in that, what it has done to us, made us contemptuous of one another, of physical contact, of emotional contact. It's made echo chambers out of our spaces on social media, where we seek out affirmation, where we seek out people who agree with us. This is wonderful stuff. It's hugely important. It's happening. We're into solutions now, Nick. There are obviously people listening to this program with youngsters, and they will be overwhelmed when they hear this. How do you get to people? How do you speak to people who are going to be under enormous pressure to present their children with these devices? What can they do, Nick?
Well, I mean, it's you're the parent. You got to be the parent, and it's restriction. I mean, it's a limit. I mean, it's how much time do you really want them on? You can't totally turn them off, but you've got to limit it, and you've got to broaden their horizon in terms of actual interactions, physical interactions. And a lot of parents don't do that either these days. Quite frankly, people are themselves lost in sort of that stress and avoidance cycle, which is really what a lot of the electronics is. It's avoidance of personal interaction. And I think you just have to push into that personal interaction. Look your children in the eye in that conversation. Look the people around you in the eyes when you have that conversation, any conversation, and start connecting on that level. Get the machines out from in between you. I mean, even the simple interactions. When you're sitting in the restaurant ordering, don't be looking at your phone. Connect with the person serving you. They're not a waitress or a waiter. They're a human being. They represent divinity at a fundamental level. If we just can appreciate a little bit of each other in that way, including our children, everybody feels that. Everybody knows that. They recognize that. It resonates internally with the core of what we are as divine beings. Start there. Connect. Talk to people. Recognize that, and I think we begin this chain reaction of events. See what happens. You'll be amazed when you actually meet someone and you see them as divine, and you feel that in your consciousness and in your soul as you're talking to them. They know it. They feel it. People come together on that. It builds their ability to move through their day just as effectively as yours. The solutions are that. Don't underestimate what you do. I'll give you, I had a very deep discussion with my oldest son, who's 40, about running for public office, which is sort of a genetic defect in my family, I think.
Yeah.
But
predisposed.
We're having this very big discussion about knowing, absolute knowing that this is what you're to do, because I said you can have a lifetime of politics and have an impact, or you can be walking down the street and cast a smile at the right person at that strategic second and have a greater impact on the world than your entire career. I said, you don't know. There are no small things. But what you do have to know is that's where you're going to register your life energy, and that's the place that you're called to do it. And otherwise, the effect of being there will have no effect at all. You're better off knowing you're following a right path for yourself and rendering that smile that's easily given and may change the world. So I say to everyone listening, there are no great or small things. There's just things being done with the right intention. Look into the eyes of your neighbor, see their divinity, and then begin speaking to that. And you will be respectful. You will hear each other differently. And you can walk away disagreeing, but still recognizing each other as sovereign souls.
Do me a favour, don't leave it as long before coming back, will you? That's a magnificent way to leave that. This is cutting edge work. It's cutting edge work. It's earthpulse.com. Links to Earth Rising 1 and 2 and Angels Don't Play That Harp, but also links to a lot of information, including how to break the zombie trance, which is where we came in on this, are there. We first spoke back in 2009 when I was doing this in Spain. And I know you're very generous when people contact you for various shows, TV and radio, and you pretty much do everything, which means you practice what you preach. And I'll say something, Nick. Some months ago, having spent probably weeks and weeks and weeks in a studio and in an office, never getting out, and being connected to the internet and the radio studio and the phones, I happened to stumble out of the house and to a local pub, and this isn't an Irish drinking story, but to a local pub with my better half, Caroline, and we sat in the sunshine, and pretty soon we're surrounded by people whom we didn't know, they didn't know us, we didn't know them, having a conversation. It went on for hours. I swear, Nick, it felt like a 3-week holiday. Do you know that? Human contact. Indeed. Human contact. How extraordinary.
And this is the secret of it. Really, it is about that. We can lift each other up, and as we do, we lift ourselves. And all boats rise with the rising tide. And there's a tide rising because a lot of people are starting to pay attention.
Earthpulse.com. You've just been listening to Dr. Nick Begich live from Anchorage in Alaska. Great pleasure, Nick. I look forward to speaking to you again in the very near future. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
The wonderful Dr. Nick Begich there, live on the line, as I said, from Anchorage in Alaska. Check out earthpulse.com. That's his website. where you'll find out lots more about the work he's doing on connecting people emotionally and disconnecting them from the technology. Fascinating stuff.